Hello and welcome. This is a brief tutorial on how to set up a document in Affinity Publisher. This is going to assume that you're using 8.5 by 11 size paper just because it's one of the various trim sizes available. So let's start by getting into document setup here. We're going to create a new document. And over here you're going to see a bunch of options. Right now I have letter selected, so it's giving me 8.5 by 11. It's 300 dpi, which is exactly what you want for print. I have it set for inches because, unfortunately, I'm in the US and that's how we measure things. Number of pages, this doesn't really matter, but you can start with a default number of pages. Not a big problem. We're going to see whether or not we prefer embedded or linked. I'm going to go with preferring linked, because it'll keep your file size small, and if you're working on something with an awful lot of pictures, you're going to want to do this, because otherwise your computer is going to probably start having problems. We're going to talk more about art management in a few, but we'll start here. For pages, I like to have facing pages, which means that you have two pages showing as if you were looking at a book. Now, this may or may not be necessary for certain projects. If you are only looking at this as a virtual product, facing pages may not be necessary for you. But when you're doing something that's ever going to be in print, facing pages will help you get a view of what it's going to look like. Printers require you to separate the pages and send them individually as just one page, but it helps a lot when you're visualizing things. And as usual, we're going to be starting on the right-hand side for pages. The reason you might want to start on the left is, say you're working with a language that is meant to be read from right to left, or like Japanese or Chinese text. So there is an option to start from the left, but again, as we're working in English, I'm going to start on the right. Then, since this is for print, this one's really important. We're looking at color format right here. For print, you're always going to be doing CMYK for color formatting. That is really important. If you are looking to do any kind of printing, printers work in CMYK. Sorry about that. Next, we are going to look at margins. Margins are typically going to be the same on all sides except the inner side for print books. For print books, the inner margin should be bigger. I'm not sure why this is set up all funky, but we're going to set the margins to 0.5 all the way around. And then I'm going to unlink them, as you can see here, and we're going to make the inner margin 0.75. It's a little bigger on the inside always, because it makes sure that you're going to be able to have room for the fold in the center of the book. In addition, if you are doing something with art, you're going to be worried about something called bleed. When you're working with a printer, bleed is the area just outside where the page stops that you're going to actually have the art go to, in order to ensure that the art goes all the way to the edge of the page. In most cases, bleed is 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125. And again, we don't want bleed on the inside edge because that's going into the crease, so we don't need bleed there. Alright, so it looks like we have all of our document settings all good to go. And we're going to create our document. Here is what it looks like. Our next section here is going to be doing something with what are called master pages. That's this right here. Master pages are basically format pages that can let you apply a single format to the entire book. I'm going to put some guides on here just to give you a quick idea of what they look like. And as you can see, this master page is applied to all the pages in the document. As you can see with the fact that there are two pages here, we have what's called a spread, and that's what this is going to look like. So you have these pages, which are the individual pages, then you have these pages, which are the spreads. You're always going to end on a left-facing page. That's because when the printer is done printing, you're going to see the back of one of these pages. It's always going to end on the left, and it's always going to start on the right because it is the front of one of these sheets of paper. One of the neat things about master pages is you can set up multiple of them. I'm going to open a tutorial document and I'll show you how that is useful. Alright, here's my templates document. This document has a bunch of guides in it. This book was laid out to have 2 columns of text here and here, which you can set up in the settings. And I put guides everywhere, as you can see. I have guides for each third of the page, I have a guide for the half of the page, and I have guides for each of the columns, the center of the page, and a few other things. Each of the margins gets a guide. And this allows me to quickly see where all of these things can be laid out, because I'm using this to create art. Or rather, I'm using this to lay art out. This is actually a template for a tabletop game book that I have been working with. So in this book, we have a bunch of art, as one is wont to do in tabletop books. So I have master pages that have these spots set up for each of the pieces and the styles of pieces and where they can go on the page. These are not meant to be laid out adjacent to each other. I can apply a master page to either the left page or the right page. It doesn't always have to be together, but I made them in spreads so it would be very easy for me to quickly identify which one it is. So single column, 1/3, middle outer means I know where the art is going here, and I can just apply this master page to the right-hand page or the left-hand page. But having it in both together just makes it easier rather than having twice as many pages here. And as you can see, I have created these layout positions for all of the different places and sizes of art that I think that we're going to be potentially using in this game book. So I've created essentially a menu for myself to give me the option to put these images wherever I like through the book, just by selecting which master page I would like to work with. And it means that I don't have to go through the process of setting up the size of this box every time, because we're working with standard art sizes. So I've created these boxes to be the standard art size based on these guidelines, which I've also let the folks who are making our art know, and I can just place the art in these boxes and not have to worry about whether or not the text is going to fit on the page. I can just think about, all right, so I would like to have this art piece up here, and I would like to put text under it. I can just apply this to a page, so I can have a template of, I know the art's going here, and I can set up the text boxes. Also, you'll see down here how we have these lines and this weird hashtag or pound icon. Let me zoom in so you can see it more easily. This right here is a special character. It is actually going to be the page number on each of the pages. So when you look at this in action and outside the master page document, we're actually going to be seeing the page numbers down the bottom. So I'm not going to take you through every single one of these master pages, though I will eventually get down here. Let me get down here. This is a chapter start page. Chapter starts, whether they are on the left or the right, as you can see. You're never going to want to have your page number on a chapter start page because they're considered kind of distracting, and you're going to want to have some space for either art, or if you're just doing text, you're going to want to give some large area above the chapter header just to really visually set off that this is a distinctive spot and we are really starting something different here versus other places in the book. I also have a master page that's a shadow. This is applied to pages, and it doesn't look like it's going to be useful, but it actually looks pretty neat. In context, all of these master pages, there's an example of the shadow down the middle of the book. It looks like there's a crease in the book and it can open in either direction. We're using that for PDF copies, just so it feels more like a real book. Right here, the only master page I have on this page is what is called the base page. It has none of the art on it, it just has this parchment background that I have put together, and it has all the guidelines, which means that it'll make it easier for me to lay out text boxes too. Well, the margins for the columns do show on the background, even without the margin lines here. I find these lines are a little easier for me to see, so I like having the guidelines there. It just makes it faster for me to see, and since I'm working in the same format for every page, having the guidelines on every page is useful to me. Now, here is a spread. We have 2 pages here. Again, I just kind of applied both of them to the same page because I was actually going to be setting up a document that shows in action, how many words you're going to fit on a page with these particular pieces. So here we have the 1/3 page. You see how the art goes outside. We've got this bleed area, and it's going to be 1/3 of the page, single column, outside edge, top, because the inside is actually a different size. So if I were to move this to the inside, you would see that this is a different size than this because we have this extra space here in the center margin. So that's something to be aware of. Always take into account, if you're doing art, that the center margin is always going to be a little bigger than the outside one, just because of the nature of having the fold in the center of the book. If you're just working virtually and just doing PDFs, you don't need to worry about this part so much. In fact, it should all probably be about the same, but as I'm working on a physical print book that will also be PDF, I have included the larger margin on the inside. Now, here you can see some lovely lorem ipsum that I'm using as filler text to show how the text might flow around these different things. Now, I don't have all of these text boxes linked. In fact, each page is set up individually so that it's not going to be all linked as a single document. Linked text boxes are something that we are going to get into in this video, but we're not quite at that point yet. So let's check out text styles, which is the next thing I would really like to discuss as we're getting into this exploration. Oh, I forgot, before we move to text styles, I should mention something else about master pages. When you're using a master page and applying one to a page, you right-click, apply master. This is for both of those pages. You can see specified pages 2 to 3, and you can choose which master you want to use on the page. In the application of this, you can have it either replace the existing master or you can add it. So if I wanted to say, I would like to have more art than this here. I want to have art, let's go with 1/3 on the bottom. So it would be the bottom corners and the outer edges. To the current spread, we're going to not replace existing. We're going to just add it. Nope, here we go. And it has added this box here without removing anything else. It's just added that on top of it, which is very useful. Another useful feature in Affinity, which I know also exists in InDesign, but we're working in Affinity, is if we go to layers up here, we can see all of the items and what layer they're on. These red boxes are the master items. They are locked. That means that I can't move them around like I can move this. If you'd like to edit the master items on a single page for any reason whatsoever, you can right-click them and say Edit Linked. You see how it shows that red bar? This shows that I'm actually editing the master items. And the master items I can pull around and change and move. You can see the this right here. I have it set up as a group. But you can see I can move the page number around if I want to. I have the background in there twice because I applied 2 different masters. But that is absolutely an option for you should you choose to use it. And that will mean that you can apply a master to a whole document without having to worry about changing a master and making a master for every single possible iteration. You can just change the elements on the page if you choose to. In this case, since I don't really want that master on this page, I'm going to go to base page. I'm going to have it replace the existing because I don't want to have several layers of master on there. That's going to add bulk to the document. Even if you can't see it, the program does render it, and that data will end up in your final PDF. So I've just gone and removed the other master that I had applied, and I've gone back to just this double page right here. But that's a quick run through of how you can use master documents, and as said before, instead of selecting the whole spread, I can just select page 3, and I can apply a master just to page 3. So I'm going to apply this one just to page 3, and as you can see, it didn't apply it to both pages. So that's a really easy way to just make sure that you can apply things separately. I just laid these out next to each other just to make things fast for myself when I was creating this template document. One of the first things we should discuss here is actually how to create a text frame. In this program, you don't just start typing like you do in a Word program, because these aren't pages like they are in a word processor. You are actually going to create a box, like here, a text box, And into this, you can put a bunch of text. So let's just grab all of this text, and I'll show you how to link them. But we have this text in this box, and as you can see here, there's a little red eye with an arrow next to it. This means that you can't see all of the text that I have put in this box. If I were to expand this down, you can start seeing more text down the bottom. The way you handle this is you have this thing right here. You can create linked text boxes, which means that it'll pull the text from the previous box and put it in this one. And as you can see, it will flow the text from one box to the next. This is extremely important when you're doing layout on larger pieces. Now, if you're just doing a novel, you can create a situation where you can auto-flow and create as many pages as you want following the text. And that works very well if you have a large amount of text, and it is all going to be similarly laid out. So when you do that, you're going to copy all of your text from your Word document and then paste it more or less into this, or you can import it using some import tools that exist in here. And then it will also import the styles and headings and so on. The only downside from doing that in a piece like a tabletop game book is in all of this, there are going to be an awful lot of headers. Regular books or fiction books, I'm going to say fiction because nonfiction regularly has a lot of headers, are going to have fewer headers. And in this case, let's just say we have a segment here and we need to have another segment next to it. So we're going to have, there's that weird heading. I'm not sure how I did. I think it's doing drop cap and heading styles somehow. Yeah, that's what it's doing. That's interesting. Okay, so we're going to do a heading style, and we're going to do character heading 1, and I'm going to fix this so it is center aligned in the box just to make my brain happy. So let's say we have this segment here, and we have another segment. If you do the text flow to create the whole thing and have all of these text boxes linked, one of the problems you will run into is I'm not going to actually be able to move or change this box without changing all of the boxes before and after it. So if I link this box, and let's just say I do a header here that I'm not going to link, but I'm just going to continue this text flow. I have to expand it a little so I can grab the arrow. There we go. Expand it into the next thing and just continue flowing with the next segment here, and just kind of stick the heading in the middle between the two. If I'm like, oh, I need to adjust the size of this box, you can see this box isn't working here, it's going to push that text into the next area, and it's going to create a headache. So it's better off if each one of these pieces underneath a heading is actually its own segment. So we don't want to have all of these different pieces just flowing into each other forever, because it will result in chaos if you, say, have to edit something further on in the book. So that's something that you need to be aware of. That also can include, for example, I've seen people be like, oh, I don't really need this text, and just leave it linked but stick it off to the side. Be like, oh, I'm just going to hide this and continue flowing into the next segment. That is going to create an absolute nightmare and will result in your inability to edit anything without causing catastrophic failure through the entire book. So, while it does take longer to, in fact, do all of these segments individually, and underneath the headings, it is going to take you longer to place. It will ultimately result in a more professional product that will be far more polished and will mean that, say I need to add this, I can just add this in here, and we can just continue flowing text. I mean, granted, there are some limitations. For example, if I want to do that, you can see there's some text that got cut off in this segment, so I might have to edit this segment to be smaller if I need to do that. But that is, one of the natures of doing all of this kind of work in layout. Of course, if you are hired as a typesetter and you have to do this kind of thing, recognize that it is not your job to edit the text. You can't go in there editing text. That would be something to bounce back to the editors if you are having spacing issues, because, of course, there's only so many words that can fit on a page without causing catastrophic failure. And if you are limited by, say, the number of pages you can have in that book, you're going to start needing to look at editing, but that is going to be the editor's problem. When you get to layout, at that point, all of the editing should be done, and you shouldn't be changing any of the text unless you come across a small typo. For example, somebody didn't use a closing quotation mark or so on, and after you are done with your layout, you're going to be sending this theoretically to a proofreader who's going to double check all of the formatting and catch any last-minute errors. So that is more or less how this flow of work is going to work. So I hope that is helpful. I'm going to use these two pages as an example page for text styles. As you can see here, I have copied some of the text from one of the other pages onto this one just to make it easy for us to look at. So text styles are essentially templates that we can apply to a bunch of text in order to create a specific look. It allows us to not have to go in here and manually change the font or what have you every single time we want to change something. So if I wanted to change the body text of this document, it would allow me to do so very, very quickly and very effectively, and I could change all of this text just by altering the body style. In order to alter it, you just double-click or right-click and hit Edit, which I guess I can't do since I'm already in here. There we go. Right-click and you hit Edit. And that will get you into the editing page of each of these different kinds of text. The body text here, this is a paragraph style. I'm going to talk about the difference between paragraph styles and character styles in a minute here, but paragraph styles are basically the bigger picture items like the leading and kerning, and it's going to include some of the other things here. So first thing you can do is you can apply a font to a whole thing. As you can see, I can change the body font for this whole segment here, and just hovering gives me a preview of what it might look like if I were to change it, which I don't really want to do. It will change all of the other body text as well in the entire document. So if you're working in a large piece, it's a way to just quickly change all of the features of something without having to do it manually, which will save you a big headache. You can change the font color and size. There's color and decorations down here. You can change the color. You can change highlight text, underlines, like you can make the underline a specific color, strike throughs, you can change the color, all of these different things. Here you can change the leading and the tracking and all this other stuff for this area. Shear is whether or not it's at an angle. You can change the language like spelling or how we're using, what spelling are we using, because it does have a spell check in here. Hyphenation, do we want it to hyphenate words at the edges of things? So if we get to like, there's not enough room for this word, it's either going to push it down onto the next line, or if we turn this on, it will hyphenate it. I always turn hyphenation off because I find it confusing to look at. But you can set up hyphenation. I have none. Let's just go to no change here. Typography script, that's what language you're using, so I could change it all to Georgian if I wanted to. The typography language, again, we're going to look at the language here. Optical alignment, I'm not sure exactly what this does. I don't really use it. For typography, we have alternates. That means that if you have a piece in here that isn't in the font you're using, you can set up alternates. For ornaments, you can set up specific things. There's all sorts of different options you have in here. You can switch it to all caps. There you go, you see it's all capitalized. You can switch it to small caps or all small caps or what have you. There's a whole bunch of different options in there. Not every font will do this, so be aware of that when you choose your font if you are looking to do the all caps or what have you in there. For paragraph, I have the leading set to 13 point for this, but you can also have it set to default, which is a bit more room, but I wanted to get more words per page, so I had it set to 13, which is, I think, a reasonable amount of space between the lines, but will also give me the ability to pull it in a little bit because the default is 14, and that's a lot of space. So I went with 13. You can also change the size of your first line indent. That's this thing up here. At the first line of every paragraph, I always have an indent. And there are some exceptions to this, like the start of a new section, you don't want to have an indent. That's an important thing to know. And you can also have a last line outdent, which I'm not sure why you would need that. Some folks like spaces before or after their paragraphs. That would look like this. It would space the paragraphs out a little bit, which can be useful for accessibility for folks who have trouble with things like dyslexia. Though when you're laying things out for print, it will add a lot of extra pages onto the end. So that is something to be aware of. I usually operate without it. I am also dyslexic, and I just tend to have the indents be significant enough that it makes it visually obvious when a new paragraph is starting, though that's a taste thing. You can also set up a paragraph beforehand, or a paragraph space before a paragraph if you choose to. And you can also make it so that there is a space or there is no space between two things of the same style, which means that if I have a bunch of body text and then I have a different style in here, say I want to switch to a header without making its own box, I could do that and have it work that way. Spacing is the space between lines. We've just covered that. Justification, that is the details on if you are going to have your text justified, which means that you have no ragged edge down the side. It makes it nice and square. It'll let you decide what's the minimum word spacing so it doesn't all get crushed together on a single line, and what is the maximum word spacing so that it doesn't start. Sometimes you'll have things like where there are fewer words on a line and it can spread out and look really weird. You can change that manually, but this will let you do a global change, which will minimize the amount of time you have to spend looking at each of those things individually and save you a little extra brain power. Letter spacing is the same. You have bullets and numbering. You can change what types of bullets you want to use in body text if you're going to be using that. So for bullets and numbering, I have separate styles set up for bullets right here. You can see that I have two different layers of bullets, and that is if I wanted to make a bulleted list. You can see I would go there and I would do it that way. And the bullet formats down here, you can change what the character looks like. There are a few options in here, and you can also find other characters, or if you would like to, you can use an ornaments style to create some bullets, or you could create bullets out of any kind of personal art you might want to do. This is going to show how far in the bullet goes, what the alignment is for these bullet points, and so on. So it will let you do a bunch of work with the bullets, and you are going to want to have a couple different classes of bullets so that you can, I'm not going to change that, so that you can make lists with a few different options. The same thing with numbering. So 1, 2, 3, if you've got lists that you want to kind of do sub numbers on, you can make them look however you want. In this case, it's 1, 0.1, 0.1 for points, which is not my preferred. I didn't actually mess with that much because honestly, I'm not really doing much for numbered lists, at least nothing nested in this, so I'm not worried about it. Then we get into headings, which are like these big boxes up here. So you are going to need several different heading options for a document, particularly if you're going to be doing different segments within it. So say we want to have this be our introduction. We're going to ignore the fact that this is the table of contents and you wouldn't have an introduction. But as you can see, we have paragraph styles here, which have to do with where they are in the heading list, which will also be related to where they show up in the navigation if you export this to a PDF and want those to be in navigation. I also have, here we go to character styles. You're going to see some different character styles. So for heading 1, I wanted it to be blue, and I wanted it to be this size. I didn't want it to be too big or too small, so I changed the heading size. Heading 2, as you can see, is smaller. We've got character style here. I have a slightly darker yellow. Heading 3 is smaller yet. Usually the heading text does get smaller as you go down in heading classifications. Then you have heading 4, which is tiny and red. Now, I originally made these headings with a different font, so it does look a little weird. And if I was using a heading 4, I would not have this giant box around it. I would make it much smaller so that it wouldn't be quite so extreme. But we're not going to currently worry about all of the nested heading possibilities. What are you doing? Stop that. So these are the two different, these are some of the different ways that headings, paragraph styles, and the text styles can interact, because I can keep things. The paragraph style is going to overrule the heading style, but if I don't have a color set for, say, some of these, I don't have a color set up for this. This one has a text size, but I can set up the character headings to not change the text size if I want to. It can just change the color. Or things here like I have strong and emphasis. So here we go. Let's say I wanted to make this bold. You see how it doesn't change the font at all, but it'll make it italic or bold. You can set these up to be all sorts of different ways so that you can have consistent styles through a document. For example, in one of the books I'm working on, I have a consistent style that is going to be a text box. There's that. The emphasis that I use in a text box is going to be actually a different color than the rest of the document because the background of the text boxes is black. So I can't just bold the text because otherwise it won't really show. So I wanted to change the color, and as such I did so using one of these styles. And as you can see here, this changes the color and makes it bold and italic. And so these are ways that these things can interact. So you can make a whole bunch of these. I strongly suggest that you make as few text styles as you can per document, just so you don't get lost. You can change the names of these text styles up here, and you can do a lot of interesting things with them, like you can have the drop cap be a different font. You would do that through, you would create a text style here that is, you'd name it drop cap style, and you'd make it whatever font you wanted. And then up in here, when we're looking at the drop caps, you would go down to style, type, no, this is bullets and numbering, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong segment, there we go. You'll go down to style and say, well, I would like the style to be this style right here. And as you can see, it will make some changes, or it should make some changes. I guess it didn't that, oh, I didn't save it. I guess I did. The character heading style, I guess I chose didn't carry over, but there we go. Now it's yellow. And since I didn't have it change the font there, it's just going to be yellow every time I do a drop cap. So you can do a lot of fun things that way. So that's a basic rundown of how text styles and paragraph styles work. Now, if you are working for, say, a large game company, or a small game company even, or even a publisher, they may actually have a default set of text styles that they would like you to use, and if they have a template document, it will come with all of these text styles preloaded. I have a document that I am going to be sharing for folks to play with down below, or you can ask me for a link, and it will come with text styles already embedded in it that you can use to play with and explore and see how they interact with your text. One very important thing to consider when you're doing layout is the readability of your text. A lot of times we can get awfully excited when we're looking at fonts and think, oh wow, this is a beautiful font, and not really consider exactly whether or not it's readable to people. That is something that we're going to explore in this segment. So we're going to go into this heading style here. It's this one. And we're going to look at the different fonts I have. Now, all of these fonts that I have are commercial use fonts that are free. I have downloaded these. You are going to want to be very careful when you are getting fonts. Now, if you're just making something for yourself, you can use any font. If it's personal, if it's commercial, it won't matter to you. So say you're making your wedding invitations, that won't matter so much. But if you're making wedding invitations for somebody else for money, you're going to need to ensure that all the fonts that you have are licensed for commercial use. When you're using free fonts, they will tell you whether or not you can use these for commercial use, and you should be able to track that pretty easily. There are also plenty of places that you can go to license fonts and purchase them, but you're going to want to make sure that the licensing covers what you want done. Some places, if you purchase a font, they will say, yes, you can absolutely use our font to make printed materials, but if you're going to embed the font like in an ebook, you're not allowed to do that. So you're going to want to make double sure that your licensing is in order. Just a quick tip for you. Now, on readability, some of these fonts that I have are extremely pretty. I have a lot of very, very attractive fonts. Some of them are more or less readable than others. This one's all right, but some people might struggle with it. Some of these are going to be a lot of fun for things that you might just want to have in one place, but some of the other ones, like this one, for example, it doesn't really work in this context because it is very, very narrow. This one would work beautifully on just a plain white background if it's quite big. You'll see the narrow swooshes, but if you're looking at something on something this size, as you can see, those little swooshes get lost and it becomes a little difficult to read. So you're going to want to avoid the use of very narrow fonts in certain circumstances. Font selection is an entire art in and of itself, so we are going to want to consider that. I'm not going to do an entire video on font selection, but I do want to cover a couple of things. So you're going to want to make sure that your font is easily readable. Also, some fonts do not have certain characters, so say you're doing something with like the AE smooshed together. I don't know what the name of that is, but that AE character. Some of these fonts don't actually have that character. Some of them also won't have, for example, an apostrophe. So let's do some quotes in here just to show you what I'm talking about. There's an apostrophe. And as we're playing with this, you're going to see some of these turn into boxes with certain styles. Just pull this out of the way so you're going to be able to see everything. See those boxes? That means that that font doesn't actually have that character in it. So you're going to want to be aware of what kind of characters or punctuation you need, because some fonts just don't have it in there. They weren't designed for that. Which is alright. Like, this is a really neat looking font, and it's a great horror font. You can see it looks very spooky and it's a little off kilter, so it creates an uneasy feeling in the person who's reading it, which is one of the reasons I like it, but it doesn't have quotation marks or apostrophes. This one right here has both of them. So as you scroll through, you can also be aware that some fonts are going to have certain things associated with them. So this particular font, it looks very much like the video game font that is used in the game Diablo. If you've played Diablo, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I think this was made in homage to that, honestly. And while you're looking at fonts, you're also going to want to consider tone. So this one right here is kind of a bubbly font. It looks a little bit like handwriting almost, but it's kind of a bubbly, cute font. So you wouldn't want to use something like this for a horror book. Whereas you probably wouldn't want to use something like, well, this is doctor handwriting. I downloaded it because it's funny. But you wouldn't want to use one of these fun sort of swooshy handwriting fonts for something extremely professional, or something like these fonts are also, you can look at them, they're kind of feminine. So you'd want to use them for something that is flavored like that. Some of these are broader, like Baskerville Oldface is, as you can see, a very just straightforward font. So you're going to want to consider your audience. These ones I downloaded actually for making science fiction books that have a need for, excuse me, I bumped the microphone, that are going to have a need for something that is a little bit edgy. It looks a little sci-fi. It makes sense if you see it on a book cover. Some of these are more of a romance font. This one is just ornaments, so obviously that is not going to be a text font you use. And I won't drag you through my entire fonts collection, but as you're going through and looking for fonts, you want to consider what kind of project you're working on. Like, these are kind of piratey, or they look a little like handwriting, so that might be fun. This one looks very 1920s, but as you can see, it doesn't have quotation marks or apostrophes. So you're going to want to consider all of those things when you're choosing your font. And another thing, as I said, you want to really consider readability. If people can't read what your font is saying, it's going to be a problem. And in a heading font, while it can be a little more artistic, this would be too much for entire body text. But for a heading font, if it's readable and interesting, that's kind of what you're going for with a header. For body text, you are looking for readable and also fits your feel. So there are certain kinds of fonts that will have different feels. So in your body text, I'm going to not save those changes. Let's get out of this. In your body text, everyone thinks of Times New Roman. In this case, I'm using Minion Pro because it's actually a little wider. I prefer slightly wider fonts for my body text because as a dyslexic, having a little more space and room for the letters to breathe means that I'm going to not mess them up as much and I won't get as confused as easily. So when you're looking at body fonts, again, we're looking for readability. Obviously, that's not very readable. It might be nice as a heading font, but it certainly isn't readable as a body font. Same thing with one of these. Mordred is pretty easy to read as a body font, and it certainly does have a certain feel to it. It doesn't feel particularly professional, though, so I wouldn't use this for an entire book. But you could use it for maybe a letter or something in a book. Here's an example of an extremely narrow font. That would be very difficult to read, so you can go through and see what you might want to read. This is kind of neat, but it certainly would make it difficult to read all the time, so you could use that for quotes or what have you. If you're doing something that's just going to be viewed on a screen and never in print, using a sans serif font might actually be easier. Sans serif fonts are oftentimes used in things like web design, and they are easier to read on a screen versus trying to read them on paper. If you're trying to read something on paper, you're going to want a serif font like Palatino Linotype, which is, you can go through all of these and like see the difference between Minion Pro and Palatino Linotype, and you can see, never use Papyrus ever, you can see the differences between all of these different fonts and see how they interact. I like this one in particular because it does sort of look like the Tolkien handwriting from his books. It's not using his books specifically, but it does sort of look like it. Some fonts are also considered more professional than others, like Papyrus, for example, is not a professional font. It can be fun, but like it and Comic Sans are going to make any text nerd probably cry in their Cheerios if you end up using them. But you can see here there's a whole bunch of options for fonts, and this is actually quite readable as body text. I don't know that I'd use it because it is a little bit bold and a little big, and you can't fit as many words on a line. But you can use things for body text. This one's also nice. It might not be good for an entire book, but it might be very nice for certain marketing materials. Or you could probably get away with using that for an entire book. It is quite pretty, though it might get a little much a little quickly. So you do want to consider how much of a font is going to be all together and whether or not it does look a little too much. Some of these fonts, they might look nice in a vacuum, but they are going to be too much if you put them all together. As the final part of our video here, I'm going to get into some of the problems you can run into when you're typing or dealing with typesetting. Some of them are called widows and orphans, which isn't a very nice name, but it refers to lines that are not in the right place on the text. So it could be something like, let me grab and change this. You see how this paragraph ends at the very bottom of this page here? And it's just a single line hanging out in this space. This is a widow. We don't really want these because it doesn't look good, and it's kind of confusing to start a paragraph here and continue it over here. You want to avoid those. Now, if you're stuck with something like this, and you can't change the size of the text box, for example. So let's say that we have a heading up here. Oh, that's an interesting heading. Fine, we'll leave it. But I can't change the size of this text box in order to get rid of that problem. You can do something individually in here to change that. So what we're going to be doing is changing the space between lines and paragraphs in order to either we can maybe push this line onto the next column, or if we're trying to make our space a little smaller, we can pull a single line from this column into the next one. So as you can see, we have our spacing here as set at 13. The leading is 13. We might want to, let's see what it looks like at 12.7. You see, it doesn't actually look too much different. You can't see visually that there's much of a difference between these two columns, which is important because you want the text to look nicely. But it did make it small enough, just small enough to pull a single line off of the next segment here, and makes this no longer a widow. So it is now happily married, I guess. But say you were in this situation, oh, well, it doesn't want to go back. Let's make you bigger, so... that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, so let's say we have an orphan, which is over here a single line of a previous paragraph or even a single word that got pushed onto the next page. We're going to do the same thing, and in this case, I think we want to keep all of this together. So we're going to make this size 13, and it's going to pull the orphan onto the same page as the rest of it here. And that's how you adjust this. It does take a little bit of doing, and it does take some attention. One of the nice things about this, though, is that it's pretty easy, and if you go into certain settings, you can set it up so that the program will naturally avoid widows and orphans. It can be a little sticky and can create some really weird spacing if you overuse it, but it is a thing. Another thing that can happen is in certain pieces, like right here, this line, all of these words are pretty close together and they sort of look like they're running into each other. That can be a real problem. And that can be really difficult to read. So we're going to go over into the character here. And if we look around, I don't remember exactly where it is in here. I know it's in here somewhere. We're looking for the space between the letters. No, not horizontal scale. That's the size of them. Hold on here. I'm going to take a break so you aren't subjected to me looking for this. There it is. I've found it. It's up here. It's this one. So in this case, we're going to actually want to adjust the kerning. You see how it makes it much bigger? If I have that off, you see how it makes it small and much bigger here? With me turning auto off, we can adjust this up or down a little as needed. It looks like it's locked for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on here. But normally you can adjust the spread of these letters to make sure that you don't end up with lines that have too many letters too close together on them. It will allow you to ensure that you don't have something like this where they sort of run into each other and it becomes difficult to read. That can be a real problem, so we are going to want to adjust that on occasion. And if this sounds like an awful lot of work where you have to stare at a screen for a long time to make sure all this text looks right, you are starting to understand why people who do layout and typesetting make a fair amount of money. There is one more item that I would like to address, and it is something called baseline grid. I believe it's in the document setup or settings, I think, preferences maybe. Baseline grid is a tool that allows you to set it up so that, sort of like lined paper, all of the lines are going to be exactly the same height and width apart, and it's going to look more or less like they're aligned on a grid, which is why it's called baseline grid. Now that can be very, very nice looking for smaller pieces, but if you're using that for a larger piece, you're going to quickly run into problems because unlike doing things manually, you're going to end up with a problem where you aren't going to be able to adjust for things like widows and orphans like down here. With baseline grid, you can't change that, and you can't change the leading or the kerning in order to accommodate for things like this. So it does mean that you aren't going to be able to edit things as effectively. Baseline grid works best for small pieces, so for example, a single page like this. If you are making a single page item like this is, or a very small document, then you'll be able to use it and be all right with it, but you won't be able to actually change a lot of things that become very important when you're working with longer documents. Next, we're going to discuss how to place images in the text. It's pretty simple. This program is wonderful in the sense that I can just drag and drop. This is a stock image that I got off of Pixabay that I'm going to be using as an example image. As you can see, it is absolutely massive, which isn't a bad thing. Working in very high resolution means that you are going to be able to make an image smaller without losing problems. If you start with a small image and try and make it bigger, you end up with pixelation and sadness. And again, I remind you that anything you are doing in print, you should make sure is a minimum of 300 dots per inch for size. So as you can see here, this is an absolutely massive piece of art. I would like, however, to make it smaller. I'd like it to fit in this box right here, which is a bit of a problem. One of the things you can do is change it so you can have a text frame. There is, let's see, convert to picture frame right here, and that should allow you to, as you can see, I can change the size of the image without warping it or distorting it, and I can fit it into the space here that I would like, and I can make sure that it is framed properly. So we're going to pull, so the lady and the tree are in the focus of the spot. And there you go. You still have the whole image in here though, and that is a bit of a problem because when you are rendering this to a PDF, for example, it is going to render all of the data of this image at this size. Now, it doesn't matter that I've shrunk it down physically. It's going to still be the same resolution image. So what we're going to do here to help with that, we are going to rasterize to mask. And that is wrong. We're not going to rasterize to mask, my bad. We're going to rasterize and trim. There we go. Now it is actually the size of this text box. It's not that giant piece. And we have rasterized it, which means it is going to be much smaller. And as you can see in the layers, it is We can drop this so it's underneath the text, so I could actually put it under the text if I so chose. But we're going to currently put this here. Now I'm going to be doing a second tutorial on how to blend some of these images into the background, which is a completely separate art, and does require you to use a photo manipulation program. I personally use the Affinity Photo, which, as you can see here, I can just transfer over to from Publisher, which is really nice because I have them both. That's one of the reasons why I like this suite of programs. But I'm going to be explaining how we can do that in another tutorial. But that's how you place art in here. You can just drag and drop from anywhere, and it is a very simple process to add art. And the picture frame means that you can size the frame to the space you need, including, I have over here, it's hanging off the edge for the bleed to make sure this would go all the way to the edge of the printed document. But having the picture frame means that you can size it to whatever size you want, frame it how you like, and then you can just trim off all that excess and you can make it fit here without changing it. Because if I was to just take the document here and say, well, I actually just want to make it shorter because it doesn't fit where I want it to go. If I were to start dragging this side, as you can see, it starts squishing, and that starts getting weird really quick. Or stretching it, that starts getting odd quickly too. Same thing with up and down. It distorts things. You can't just change things at random and have it work. So the text, that frame allowed me to pull in the sides and kind of crop it to where I wanted it rather than worry about distorting it. So that's just a very important piece that you should consider when you are using art in your text. I just want to say thank you very much for spending this time with me, and I hope this video was helpful. I hope it answered any questions you might have and can give you just a basic idea of how to get into typesetting in Affinity Publisher. InDesign uses very similar tools and very similar methods. It is just laid out a little bit differently, and the tools are in slightly different places, but ultimately the two programs are almost the same. And having used InDesign and moving from InDesign into Affinity, because I like Affinity's business model a lot better than I like Adobe's, it really didn't throw me that much, so it should be pretty easy to make the jump if you are going from one to the other in either direction. All of the tools are about the same, some of the buttons look a little different. So you can also see that Affinity has some other things up here. Anyway, I am very glad to be able to help. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below or reach out to me, and I will see what I can do to assist you in furthering your learning. Have an excellent day.